Just 1 minute, please.
Yes, I think we are good to go. Thank you, Dr. Sahu.
You can start.
Yes. So, hello everyone. Welcome to the GRFTT Expert Dialogue Series, an initiative launched by GRFTT to engage academicians and policy activists in conversations regarding topics of contemporary relevance for the benefit of a wider audience. And so far, we have had discussions on the themes of conflict in Sudan and its implications on migratory patterns and on remittances with remittances as well. And we have moved to the theme of climate change and how it forms an intersection with various other social phenomena in deciding the migratory patterns. And with us, we have today Dr. Stephen Adaawen. And let me welcome you to the discussion. So I'd like to begin by mentioning the key objective of the discussion briefly. It is to understand the nature and the extent to which climate change functions as a variable in influencing human mobility. The key questions we would like to address through this discussion are: one, can the climate change form a causal relationship with human mobility, or does it function as one among the many push factors in inducing migration? Either way, how can professionals and scholars working on climate migration understand and work a way around this complexity? The discussion aims to address these key questions, which are the imperative in engaging with climate change and human mobility. Let me also give a brief introduction of our speaker. The session guest is Dr. Stephen Adaawen, Assistant Professor of Climate Change, Population and Development at the Population Research Center, Netherlands, at the University of Groningen. Dr. Adaawen is a researcher and international consultant. He has more than 13 years of experience in being actively involved in international research and consulting for many international organizations, including the UNCCD, IOM, ICMPD, etc. And his research interests include providing critical insights, sustainable solutions, and interventions on issues of sustainability, climate or environmental change and development, with specific focus on sub-Saharan Africa and more recently, the Caribbean. So welcome, Dr. Adaawen.
Thank you.
I'm Manjima Iyer, PhD scholar at Srinagar University, India, and I shall be moderating the discussion. So let me quickly move into the discussion. So my first question to you, Dr. Adaawen, is, given your expertise in working at the interstices of climate change, migration, and development, how would you describe the relationship between climate change and human mobility? Thank you.
Yeah. First of all, thank you very much, Manjima and the whole team and everyone for inviting me. I think this is about my second or third participation in such an event such as this, and I can quite remember or see familiar faces. So I'm really very happy and thankful for this opportunity. In relation to the discussion, and also in relation to your question about the relation between climate change and migration, I mean, it's now an established fact that based on the projections and analysis of the IPCC, that and also through observations and reports, that in almost every region, climate change in the face of global warming is translating to climatic changes in almost every region. This has often reflected in the increase in frequency and intensity of weather-related hazards. I mean, talk about hurricanes, talk about storms, talk about recurring, or should I say, severe droughts, especially in East Africa and much of the Sahel. If you look at that, I mean, we have to establish the fact that the tendency, or sometimes a mistake that we often do, is that, okay, we often tend to assume that there's often a unidirectional relationship or a causal relationship between climate change or environmental risks and then what? Migration. So there's climate change, and then as a result, people move. But then if you look at the climate change or environmental migration, climate change nexus, you understand that it's a bit complex, and often influenced by a multiplicity of factors that interact at different scales to be able. So it doesn't mean that, for example, if you are in New Delhi or you are in the Netherlands, for example, and then there's a hurricane or there's a flood, if you people definitely, or should I say necessarily, have to move because of the impact of the flood, you will see that, okay, human beings by nature will have agency. So, and of course, depending on the existing capital, or should I say institutional frameworks, if people are able to recover and adapt quickly, it doesn't necessarily translate that because there's a flood, people will necessarily do what or move, even though they might be displaced or they might be affected in a way. If they're able to recover quickly, they might adapt in situ in place and might not have to necessarily move because of the existing structures, frameworks that facilitate quick recovery. On the other hand, vulnerable people might be affected. And then, of course, they might wish to migrate as a response, but then they are not able to do so because of the lack of the necessary means. Maybe they might not have the money, they might not have the necessary capital in place to be able to support them to move, or they might not even be the institutional frameworks to be able to help them to move as a response. As a result, these people might be unable to move and might be trapped, even though they might be exposed to the environmental risk or climate change impact. So what I'm trying to say is that climate change migration is not a unidirectional, or is not a cause effect, but then climate factors often interact with existing drivers, at the meso, at the macro level, at the meso, or even the micro level. So this has clearly been outlined. For example, if you look at the Foresight report that was done in looking at migration decision making in the face of climate change or environmental change, you see that a lot of factors, intervening factors, come into play. So what I am necessarily trying to say or emphasize is the fact that climate change often interacts with a lot of existing socioeconomic vulnerabilities or drivers to influence movements. So when there's climate change impact or environmental risks, it doesn't necessarily translate into movement at all. And even if you go beyond the impacts and the availability of the necessary institutional frameworks, personal factors like place attachment, cultural issues, and all of that, people might not actually want to move, even though there's a possibility that they might actually be at risk. So, for example, if my grandfather dies and leaves a land behind for me, and there's possibility of drought, or even the risk of coastal inundation due to sea level rise, I might not want to leave that land. I might not want to leave my cultural heritage. I might not want to leave my gods, my cultural affiliation, and all of that to move. So these are some of the considerations or the factors that come into play in influencing movement. So development has a role to play. So like the example I always cite in the case of Germany, for example, relates to development or the level of structures that have been put in place to address climate change impact. For example, when there was flooding in North Rhine-Westphalia in Germany, some places around Cologne, Düsseldorf, and those rural areas around the North Rhine-Westphalia, there was flooding. But we didn't hear, even though people were displaced, property destroyed and all, no, the response was massive. There were structures in place. There was a total, companies came in, institutional arrangements were made for people to have alternative living arrangements. There was food. There was a warehouse that was already set up with food, clothing, and all of those things. So the impact was there, but the people did not feel the impact as a result of all these existing arrangements. So this is just an example that I always highlight, that the impact might be there, but that doesn't mean that people will move. So it is a bit more complex. And then, of course, development also has a role to play.
Thank you, Dr. Adaawen. I absolutely agree with you that it is a much more complex, it's a much more complex phenomenon with various factors at play. And climate change quite exacerbates the already existing vulnerabilities.
Yes.
And this brings us to the next point of how on the policy front, can we assess this multiplicities and inequality in the impacts of climate change on people? For instance, how do methodologies and tools such as the Human Security Policy Assessment Tool and the Integrated Human Mobility Assessment Tool that you have worked on envision climate change as a variable in understanding human mobility? And what role do they play in shaping effective policies and interventions? Thank you.
Yes. Measuring environmental migration or human mobility, if you like. Human mobility here in the context of climate change, we're always looking at what? Migration, which is voluntary. We're looking at displacement and, of course, planned relocation. But then increasingly, people are also bringing in the fact that immobility is also an issue that we need to address in terms of that is a relevant or key issue that also that requires attention. So it is often really very difficult to be able to adequately measure, environmental migration with existing tools or whatever. I know, for example, the IOM has a displacement, the DTM, that is the displacement tracking matrix, other innovative tools or methods used to measure or try to establish the relationship or correlation between environmental events and population movement. People have been using mobile phone data in terms of using, I know, for example, a study was done in Bangladesh and to ascertain in times of flooding and all of that, how people move by monitoring telephone communication and interaction with, for example, the network and all of that. People have come up with several using GIS and remote sensing information or aerial photos and all of that. So all these are ways or give an indication of the complexity or how difficult it is. So most of these numbers, that's why it's relatively difficult to be able to have data specifically related or detailing that this person has moved or this category of people have moved as a result of what? Climate change. But of course, recently we are looking the discussion on how to enhance protection and also for effective management or to address the mobility dimensions of climate change and crisis have come out with innovative tools and whatnot. And one of the main tools that I was part of, a colleague of mine, we worked on was the Human Security Policy Assessment tool that we developed for the Eastern Caribbean region, which we piloted. And the hope was that the insights that we gathered will be applicable to other countries as well. And basically, what the tool that was developed was to kind of like come up with indicators based on existing global frameworks like the Sendai framework, or look at the Global Compact for Migration and other existing frameworks in relation to the human security approach or the different elements of the human security approach. So based on that, we developed indicators, and these indicators were then applied in the context of the existing policy frameworks or legal instruments burden on climate change, environmental change, and migration management in these selected Eastern Caribbean countries. So you are able to use the tool to be able to analyze in how far the human mobility dimension is addressed on the one hand, and then on the other hand, how these existing governance frameworks or policies and legal frameworks at the national level make provision to address the human security or human insecurity aspect. So you're looking at, for example, in the context of human mobility or climate change, how does a particular policy, which, for example, mentions or make reference or provisions to address, for example, the mobility dimensions of climate change, takes into account the human insecurity aspect of the movement. So looking at, for example, economic insecurity. So if you are saying that in your policy, you are going to address forced migration as a result of climate change or hurricane, the impact of hurricanes or related hazards, how does that policy make provision or outline measures to address the economic insecurities that come with the movement? So has it make provisions for jobs, the unemployment? If, for example, Manjima was working in for example, in a cocoa farm or whatever farm, and that the person, as part of the measures, has to be relocated to a safe area, is the land there able to support her previous livelihood? Are there provisions, land allocated? Are the housing system? Are there jobs, even alternative jobs, even if Majima cannot even do her farming activities again? Are there alternative livelihood that can address the economic insecurities that may arise? And for those who are not able to move at all, what are the provisions to also address their economic insecurities? Talking about food. Food is very, very important. Food is critical to everything. If you look at everything, I will always say that food is very important. How does it address the food insecurity aspect in terms of food, nutrition, food and nutritional security, talking about health security, that's looking at the different aspects of the human security approach, personal security, for example, women or children as the most vulnerable of persons on the move. What provisions are there for people to be able to protect these vulnerable? So, because in the case of displacement or an encampment, in an instances where people have been displaced and they have to be encamped, what are the provisions in place to address the health aspects of, for example, this vulnerable group? And we know that women are very vulnerable, and in the cases of a camp where they might not have access to water, they might not have access to food, a woman might go the next or might even be exploited sexually or even abused physically in the camp. So what are the provisions that have been put in place? So this is basically, for example, how the human security policy assessment tool will look at with the integrated human, the integrated human mobility assessment tool. This was also piloted in for example, in Sierra Leone last year. One basically looks at the entirety of countries, in the sense that apart from the policy level, how national agencies and international agencies in a particular country, address the human mobility aspect of climate change. So in terms of funding, in terms of provisions in the context of crisis or emergencies, how national institutions or governments, and in the case of Sierra Leone, for example, one of the issues that came up was that the mainstream of the human mobility within the context of climate change was actually, lagging. Most of the issues that they were looking at did not really outline specific measures to address the specific aspect, even though it is a country that has been plagued with climate change impacts in terms of flooding, of Freetown, people, internal migration from the rural areas as a result of erratic or highly variable rainfall and all of that. Another issue had to do with, for example, the lack of established budget, or should I say a financial mechanism to be able to undertake climate change adaptation activities or disaster risk management activities as part of climate change, climate action within the country. So this tool was actually developed by Cadre. It entails, and the same as the human security assessment tool, a list of questions, or should I say, indicators in an Excel or complete Excel sheet, where you can draw specific questions to address specific issues that you may want to examine within the context of a particular country. So this is one of the many, tools that we try to use or deploy in trying to understand the climate change human mobility nexus. And a critical issue before I conclude that is also very important. I think, okay, maybe I'll just hold on and then maybe we'll address it in the subsequent discussion. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Raman. We'll come back to that. In fact, the specificities regarding the indicators and how they translate into real-time policy assessments is very, I find it very curious, and we'll come back to it after the participant discussion, perhaps. So regarding the indicators and how you have framed policy frameworks which with reference to the national, international, and even at the sub-regional level, it brings me to the question of development and how there can be different patterns of development which can give rise to various manifestations of human security in different regions. So could you elaborate on how aspects associated with development, such as the green economy, remittances, and rural development, how they interrelate with human mobility associated with the climate change? Thank you.
Yeah, well, like I indicated before, development in terms of how it interrelates with the human mobility aspect. So I will cite, for example, there's an increasing or growing shift towards greater sustainability, and one of the issues has to do with the green economy. I mean, green economy basically, tries to kind of like transition from high emission economies in terms of carbon emission to low carbon production and emission. And that will mean greening every aspect or sectors of the economy. Now, in terms of its relationship, for example, with human mobility, we first of all understood, or as part of the discussion, we indicated, for example, that normally climate change impact on human mobility is not clear-cut. If we look at human mobility, we have the migration, displacement, and plant relocation, and of course, talking about issues of immobility. So, and if you look at the IOM as a UN organization, has always promoted a positive, approach, of migration as a potential strategy to enhance adaptation to climate change impact. So that being said, that will mean that measures to effectively manage migration, and the argumentation or the discussion seems to suggest that well-managed migration can actually bring about what? Climate adaptation and improve, promote resilience. So in that case, how, for example, can the increasing shift towards greater sustainability and the green economy, enable adaptation or resilience, apart from the direct impact in contributing to reducing carbon or climate change or environmental or degradation, if you like, through the green production? How, for example, in the phase of the global call for promoting regular and safe migration be exploited to contribute to the green economy? So for places that people might be exposed and then climate change might influence these drivers, alternative livelihood opportunities which are sustainable or green jobs, like they always say, can contribute to enhancing resilience. In what way? So, for example, for people in sub-Saharan Africa or people in other areas that are very vulnerable in terms of their farming or agricultural activities, which are mainly rainfall dependent, can be supported to venture into alternative green livelihoods. So we've had, for example, in the cases of, I think Bangladesh, they had this, I've forgotten the name of the project, but it was a project that had to do with promoting small solar energy plants for households. I've forgotten the name of the project. And then, of course, also encouraging young people to venture into green jobs in terms of what? If you are shifting to solar energy or windmills, you will definitely require engineers, marketers, and all of that. And there's evidence, for example, in Burkina Faso, people were encouraged, to shift to from use of biomass to biofuels. And for example, they train people how to do to construct biodigesters and all of that. And all this created or stimulated an economy, and people so many people got jobs in the marketing aspect, in the construction and all of that. And in terms of how even migration could also be leveraged, to contribute to the green economy or development, if you like, through remittances and all of that. Migrant remittances contribute a lot to poverty reduction and can actually even there's evidence to suggest that remittances could also actually improve resilience and adaptation. So, for example, my family in rural northern Ghana, for example, if there's a period of drought, and then maybe crops, millet, and all of those things have not been successful as a result of this drought, definitely there will be food insecurity or issues of food scarcity. So at that level, being a migrant, not necessarily a climate migrant, and living in Europe, if I'm able to remit even 100 or even €200, you are able to buy enough grain to sustain the family for more than a year and to buy whatever they want. So remittances or migration or development in this regard, in terms of the flow of remittances, could also actually help in promoting climate adaptation or helping vulnerable families to cope with the impacts of climate change, and thereby invariably also trying to address the mobility aspect because persons that would have migrated as a result of the impact on their livelihoods are able to be, to use the remittances that they've received to buy food or even to seek medical care or even what do we call it, pay for education and all of that. And in terms of the green economy, young migrants will also, support the green economy by being trained, to fill up the green jobs that will be created or to fill up the gaps or void that will be created. Because if you are moving to green economy, that means many people, as much as many jobs will be created, many people also will lose their jobs as a result of what? Shifting to the green. So in as much as they might be upscaling, reskilling, and all of that, young, vulnerable people, or in as much as contributing to safe migration, could also be empowered through what? Skills development, skills training, and all of that, to, on the one hand, contribute towards the shift to the greater sustainability, and on the other hand, to also begin to look into alternative livelihoods, in such that the impact of climate change might not really, be that significant if they have alternative livelihoods. So these are the ways that I can, maybe through the discussion, we can begin to talk more, but then these are the ways in which contribution of rural development through the promotion of green jobs, through remittances, and of course, alternative livelihoods, TVET, that's taking up vocational education training in these areas, because in most of the global South, sometimes we view TVET as areas for people who are not inclined or have the desire to do well in academics. So, for example, carpenters and all of those things are seen as jobs. People who want to attain formal education to sit in offices and look good and all of that. But these are also areas that skills are lacking in most of parts of the global South. So these are areas that governments could actually, through the support of international organizations and all of that, look to begin to develop these areas to enhance skills development in these areas, and also in promoting alternative livelihoods. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Adaawen. In fact, the relation between rural development and sustainability and green jobs kind of brings me to a field visit that I made. So in Rajasthan, regarding the Barefoot College project. So under that, it's a transnational project, but under that project in India, rural women in Rajasthan are trained to run solar panels and ensure that their households are connected with the solar energy produced as a result of this. And this had multiple social implications. While it inevitably brought energy to remotest parts of the country, it has also prevented various social evils like child marriages by empowering those women who are otherwise illiterate. So there is a huge connection between building a sustainable economy through green jobs and through promoting rural development. So on that note, I would like to open the floor to the discussion by participants. We welcome questions from all of you, and I look forward to a very enriching discussion. Please. I would also like to know what Professor Raj, I'd also like to know certain insights from Professor Raj, since she is also actively involved with the project of climate migration. Dr. Raj, you're muted.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me first thank Dr. Adaawen for this very stimulating insight into this very complex subject. It's a very complex subject. We are still, as scholars, researchers, trying to understand that there is no direct relationship between climate change and migration, because often migration is as a result of various factors, social, economic, political, and that environment then becomes one of the add-on factor rather than the factor. So this complexity makes it very difficult then to pinpoint what is the role of climate change on migration. But we still need to understand, because there are some international frameworks. We're talking about migration at the international level. While we don't know really, people who are moving, are they moving because of economic, social, political reasons, or are they moving because they're displaced climatically or environmentally? So I think this is one area where we have to confess as scholars, as researchers, that there are knowledge gaps. We don't know yet. And therefore we can't say with certainty that X percentage is due to this. And therefore it's important to exercise caution when we say legal pathways should be open. That's my view. Yes, legal pathways need to be open because people are moving, but not necessarily because they're climatically affected. Excuse me. And secondly, what I wanted to say was that initially we all know when due to environmental or climatic reasons, people move, they move internally. They don't just pack up and go, okay? Because it will depend on, as you rightly said, it depends on the resources people have, whether capital, whether willingness, their attachment to the place they live in and so on. So they won't get up and leave and go outside their area. So my question now is, since we are talking about, increasingly there is a visibility on the role of climate change or environment on mobility, even though we can't say how much. Should the emphasis or attention not be given to how internally, because it's basically internal migration, 80% or more than that is internal migration. Yes. And I find that the discussion is a little bit silent on the role of countries, whether it's at the local or national level, in preparing themselves to this eventuality. And this has been happening, but it wasn't at a scale that it caught the attention of policymakers. Now it is happening more frequently with floods, drought. But do you have to move? Your animals have to be moved because they have to find water. So there is an intensity as well as magnitude of these crises, which call for greater preparedness. We take the case of Japan. Japan has earthquakes every day or every other day. It's not that people are displaced, there is preparedness. Same in the Caribbean. In many islands in the Caribbean, Cuba is highly prepared for hurricane. Before the hurricane season sets in, there's preparedness so that people's rights are respected and so on. So how do we address this whole issue of internal migration and and protecting the rights of those who are on the move or likely to be on the move And I mean, how serious are the countries in the South where these things are happening more frequently? Thank you. I'll come in again.
Okay. Najima.
Can I ask a question, or what is?
How do Dr. Adaawen, how do you prefer it? Do you want to take a couple of questions, or do you want to go ahead with the rest?
You are the moderator. The way you want us to go, I think we'll go that way. Yeah.
Sorry?
I'm looking at you. How do you prefer it?
Since it was a very nuanced question, I would prefer if you address Professor Raj's question, then we can move
Okay.
ahead with the next question.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Raj is very right on that one, because if you look at all these climate-related migration, as the way I always want to put it, is mostly internal, and or even if it is cross-border at all, it's often to neighboring countries. And in terms of climate migration or internal migration, we've always seen that the movement has always been from rural areas to urban centers. And this is increasingly being recognized by national governments. And in as much as it's accompanying problems that it brings, it doesn't, it has to do with issues of increasing urbanization and the attendant problems of having so much pressure on existing social infrastructure, social services, and of course, and high unemployment rates in urban areas and slum conditions and all of that. So, but then the question, if you look at most national migration policies, I mean, the attention seems to, like she indicated, seems to always focus on international migration, basically seeking to see how they can harness the relationship between the country of origin and diaspora in terms of the flow of remittances and all of that. But without recourse to internal migration and the likely implications this will have, even on urban areas in terms of urbanization and even rural depopulation. People are not looking at that, because who are the people always on the move? They are relatively the young people, always within the economically active ages. And in my own research that I did, for example, in rural Northern Ghana as part of my my PhD research, what became apparent was that even in the rural areas, without even looking at data and all of that, you could just see that households were basically composed of what? Aged, or let's say old grannies, and grandpas, and little young ones, with the economically active one having left the rural areas, even to the urban south of the country, for example. And even in instances where, for example, it's often always circular migration, where people just go and come back during the rainy season to help with farming activities, it became apparent that people were even now staying longer and not even returning at all. So you find children on garners fields and all of that with their old grannies in the sense that at the relatively higher ages, you tend to find, if you look at the population pyramid, you tend to find that the male from the 60s, 70s going, males tend to die off, leaving only, more females at the top of the population pyramid. So you have a broad-based one, but then those in the middle are traveling. So what are governments doing? In as much as governments recognize the problem, what is apparent is that there is no political action in terms of political commitment to see how they can address these issues of what? Rural urban outmigration. And one obvious area has to do with what? Development in terms of job availability, coming up with innovative for rural areas that are mostly engaged in agriculture activities, which is also often rain-fed, come up with irrigation projects or even good agricultural practices, or should I say programs, that can tend to give opportunity to youth training employment opportunities and all of that. But what do we find? Most of these programs or initiatives are often politically laden, in the sense that ruling governments or the intent of the project or initiative is often not always to address people who really need it, but then tend to address party faithfuls. So you have politicians and parties, instead of, for example, giving out job opportunities or training or whatever equipment that might be given to young people in rural areas, or even fertilizers, they tend to give it to what? Because of corruption, they tend to give it to their party faithfuls, to the detriment of those who actually need. So these are some of the challenges. It is the fact that governments recognize this problem, but the political commitment, and even they come up with very interesting projects. You look at all across the countries, very interesting programs, youth employment programs, agriculture, food improvement or agriculture improvement programs, and all of that. But then translating or implementing these programs on the ground and actually, identifying the vulnerable people who benefit, or the beneficiaries who actually need, is often lacking. So these are some of the challenges that we have. And then so as to how we can navigate this issue is really for governments to see how these policies that they often come up with can actually be operationalized on the ground. And on the other hand, also begin to look at, and then of course, conscientize people and revise educational curricula to fit the context or to fit the changing situation, and also to project, TVET, skills training, and all of that as also an important aspect of our economic life, rather than the age-old colonial educational system where sitting in the office or just learning how to speak very good English and be able to read ABCD is seen as an achievement or what everyone should be aspiring, to hope for. So these are areas that governments really need to take a radical look, and then of course, review educational systems. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Adaawen. In fact, those are very important insights, since when we talk of climate migration, there is often a focus on international migration and very less on internal migration, even though, especially in the phase of hazards, people often look into the immediate safety nets, often resulting in internal migration. Also, the point of intersectionality becomes very important, since even the legal pathways and the legal programs are often geared towards the youth, and there are hence it becomes important on the experience of the aged, the women, the children, and how they see these legal programs and how they experience mobility in the context of climate change. That becomes very important too. Also, thank you, Dr. Raj, for the question. We had another question, right? Was it Dr. Mahalingam?
Yes. Yeah, I'm just, can I ask a question now?
Sure, please.
Yeah. Actually, it's a very complex, and also as Dr. Raj Bardoli pointed out, there's a lot of knowledge gap in terms of.
Oh, I think he's gone off.
Dr. Mahalingam, we can't hear you now.
Am I audible now?
Yes.
I got disconnected, so because due to poor connectivity. My question, we come to the question straight away. I want to know the challenges on women in terms of climate-induced migration. What are the challenges they face? Are there any studies on impact on women due to this climate-induced migration? Can you throw light on that?
Does the impact of climate on women?
Yes.
Okay. Majima, would you like me to go ahead?
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Oh, all right. Thank you very much, Mahalingam, for your question. Of course, if you look at in terms of climate change, women, children, aged persons living with disabilities, and all of those are often are often the most vulnerable groups in that context, and that will always need special attention and protection to address their specific needs because of their vulnerability. Now, if you look at women basically are very integral when it comes to production and all of that. And, and because of their gender and the kind of role that we assign to them, they are often also mostly affected. In terms of agricultural production, for example, we have women that are actively involved right from the farming, the production, and the harvesting, and all of that. And in terms of even the household setup, women are basically the ones that are actively involved in terms of fetching water, making provision, taking care of the kids, and all of that. So if you look at, aside from the direct impact in terms of any hazard that may occur, where because of their physical or biological makeup, they might not be able to readily, move to safety. In terms of climate change impact, if, for example, in the household setup, women will have to walk a distance in the face of drought, and there's water scarcity or issues relating to unavailability of rainfall. The ability to be able to access water and also to be able to engage in farming or access food, within the household setup is very, very difficult for them, in the sense that they will sometimes have to walk in, and I'm talking from experience because I'm from the rural savannah of northern Ghana, where I grew up in the rural area. And I understand how sometimes you have to walk more than kilometers just to be able to get to a stream or even a borehole that has been drilled somewhere to fetch water with your grandmother and all of that. And this exposes them to a lot of danger, in the sense that apart from the possibility of snake bites and all of that, I mean, the possibility for them to be sexually exploited or even attacked, on the way in the millet or even in the bushes somewhere around there is also very great. So in terms of, for example, access in terms of their own economic empowerment, if women that are engaged in agriculture, and they are mostly in our part of the world, they consider them as women who engage in the accompaniments, in the sense that they are mostly into the growth of vegetables, tomatoes, okra, and all of that. And that also serves to kind of like the money or the revenue that they generate. In terms of that, it gives them some level of economic empowerment. So if they are not able, because of climate change, to be able to actively undertake those economic activities, then it further impoverishes them and put them in a very, disadvantaged position that further exposes them to exploitation and all of that. So if you look at women, say, you might not say that, okay, climate change does not affect them. It affects them in several ways, and also affects their whole being as women, because of the nature of their vulnerability in terms of their gender. So, and if you look at most of these areas, because of gender differences, the people who always control the factors of production or economy and all of this are always the men. So in that regard, if women are unable to develop themselves because of climate change impact, lack of access to credit facilities, or even opportunities to be able to undertake their own initiatives, then it will further undermine their ability to be able to be independent and protect themselves for whatever exploitation or vulnerability they might find themselves.
Thank you, Dr. Adaawen. Again, as I mentioned before, intersectionality is very important to be accounted for when one forms an understanding of climate change and human mobility. Regarding the impact of women, there has been a study in the Indian context which showed how child marriages have increased in the rural India due to the factors caused by climate change, such as failure of crop production. Hence, of course, intersectionality has to be accounted for. We have another hand raised. Please go ahead with the question. Yes, hello. Hi.
Hi, I'm Swadesh from Telangana, India. I'm a student of migration and diaspora. I would like to ask, it's a COP28 in November at UAE. It will time to come discuss about climate action and climate justice. But many conferences and many agreements are already done by the internationally. I would ask you how bring these nations together to stand for one dialogue for climate justice and climate action. Is it possible?
So,
Over.
so are you hinting at, is it possible to arrive at an international consensus on what are the policies that have to be taken to contain migration? Yes, Dr. Adaawen, what do you think of this international consensus?
They are already ongoing at the international level, even at the COP level, where you have parties coming in and decisions and all of that. So, I mean, already you find that countries are already collaborating in terms of climate action, as to how they can collaborate, come up, and so all these emission, what do we call it? Carbon markets and countries making commitments to limit emissions, the greater shift, for example, the new EU Green Deal, the Korean Green Deal, and many countries trying to limit the level. These are all because it's not legally binding. Most of the agreements and commitments that people make is not legally binding, but these are ways by which, for example, countries, try to come together or collaborate, in terms to address or undertake climate action in addressing global warming. Or even if you're looking at it in terms of climate-related mobility and all of that, there are certain countries that actually offer opportunities for persons that have been displaced or in certain areas, small island developing states in the Pacific and all of that. I know, for example, New Zealand and Australia, they offer opportunities or create their humanitarian, provisions that they can consider to persons that have been displaced or whose homelands are being, overtaken as a result of sea level rise and all of that. So these are the bits and ways in which countries are already cooperating. So at the international level, you have all these COPs and all of that. These are all the ways in which countries always try to find ways. So that's why you have all these international, what do we call it, frameworks, the Nansen framework, you have the Global Compact for Migration and the Paris Agreement and all of that. These are all ways by which countries are collaborating or trying to find ways to cooperate in addressing the negative implications of climate change. Yeah. So, yes. Of course, with commitment from national government, of course, we know some countries that are not willing, or they might just come there and put the face, and so we are going to do that, and then they go back and do the opposite. So there are countries that are not actually reading minutes or not trying to commit to climate action, but then the efforts are already there, and they recognize the need that climate change or fighting climate change might not be, countries cannot do that in isolation. You will need countries, you need India, you need China, you need the US, and you need even countries in the global south that do not actually even emit that more, to also do their part in addressing climate change across the globe.
Yes, on that note, climate change presents a global challenge and it has to be addressed only globally. But this becomes a bit trickier when you think of climate justice, when you think of the differential impact of climate change in different countries. But of course, that's for another question. So we have more questions coming up. Jaya?
My name is Jaya Renuka. I'm a master's student in migration and diaspora from IGNOU. So I have a question which is interconnected to the previous one which was asked. So as we know, the island country of Tuvalu has has been under the worth of climate change for so many years now, and recently they have upgraded themselves to a metaverse country. So my question is that we have so many type of refugees which have been recognized by the international humanitarian agencies and all, but why the climate refugees are not recognized yet? And we have so many climate protocols like Montreal, Kyoto, and all those things, but we don't have any practical, let's say after 30 or 50 years, we can revise a climate condition which is happening. But at present, we don't have any practical international deals or agreement that help the climate refugees. So what can be done to solve this issue?
Thank you.
Okay.
That is a really very good and politically loaded question that needs. But in my opinion, it is obvious that the issue of the so-called environmental climate refugees is not really covered under international refugee law, and this is something that has been highlighted time and time again. So as a result, there are not actually really any legal instruments or legally binding provisions that will require states to make special provisions to address this category of migrants. But then one of the issues they are trying to navigate has to do with, for example, I know within the context of the Eastern Caribbean or even CARICOM, and even in the context of ECOWAS, which is they have all these existing regional mobility protocols that allows people to move freely within community citizens or nationals of participating or member states to move freely. But then the question about addressing the human rights and protection for these people is still often always lacking in some of these. So it is something that is being that has become topical, and countries are realizing the need. But then the question also is that people are not willing, or governments are not willing to stick their neck out to allow for people, because there's already the fear that migrants are invading particular countries, or also people are trying to protect their borders and all of that. So it is a question that has to do with international political commitment and in how far they are willing to go, walk the talk to address these issues. So that is why you seem that there's a seeming lag in actually integrating, revising the international refugee law, which will now employ countries to legally or be forced to accept persons who might be seeking refuge as a result of climate change. But then these provisions are not there. So it's something that really needs to be addressed at the international level, and to get the powerful countries who are also increasingly, closing their borders to see how they can commit to addressing. Because if you are actually making noise or advocating that we are advocates of good governance, advocates of democracy, respect human rights and whatnot, then this aspect of protecting people who are on the move or seeking refuge should also be something that you should look at. You should not shy away and pick and choose what you think will favor you and all of that. So that also explains why I said it was a politically loaded question. But then we need national governments to walk the talk and commit at the international level, and not rather turn back and be closing their borders because of the misconception that people are invading. There will be an invasion of certain countries, and that will possibly lead to what they call the great replacement. Such that if you are not careful, because we are not giving birth to so many people, there will be the trend of great replacement. People will come here, our culture is a threat, our jobs are, all of these things. So these are some of the concerns that people are not willing to stick their neck out, because government might fear that they might be voted out, because we are increasingly seeing far right, governments and activism and all of that. So these are some of the challenges. But of course, where there's commitment or where there's will, you can always come up with a good result. Yeah.
Yes, in fact, what Jia raised is $1 million question that confronts the current era, since it's very important that nation states commit to the course of climate change and preventing climate change in spite of the political political and electoral pressures that they face. Professor Raj, I remember I noticed that you had your hand raised, and I'm sorry I couldn't come up to you for a follow-up. So, Professor Raj.
Okay. Sorry to have taken the floor again, but thank you very much. I sense, I mean, that's again my own work, because there is mainly internal migration, and therefore emphasis or attention needs to be paid on that side. So this then leads me to the whole issue of local level governance. In order for us to understand how migration, how climate is affecting migration, it will be micro studies at the local level. And in this context, migration governance at the local level is key. And I think mapping exercise, I think Dr. Stephen, you have done some work on mapping exercises of the vulnerable areas. In other words, you know, where certain areas in a country or in a locality are more prone to these crises or catastrophes. So if once we have that mapping, because we're talking about protection, but at the same time, we also have to bear in mind who these people are and where they are and how often they are likely to be. And if it's almost every year or every 6 months, well, then with their consent, maybe they will be better off in moving to other areas. So the question I'm asking is, how can countries that are being affected by climate change more often than others who get occasional crises, floods, and so on, okay? Although everybody's in the same pot. How can they be prepared as regards mapping exercises, and what's the role of agencies responsible, whether it's IOM, whether it's a national capacity? What are the constraints to doing that? Is there awareness that they should be doing mapping exercises and allocating certain areas or designating certain areas as either no zones, no safe zones, or whatever? So what is going on in that area? Thanks very much. And I'm so sorry to have taken up this floor again. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very important question. As we speak now, I'm actually working on something with the World Bank in Dominica, where we are looking to understand, because if you look, for example, in the case of Commonwealth of Dominica, my beloved country, I always say,
and my country. And I'm really impressed that you somehow found a connection to that country. Yeah?
I'm telling you, for whatever reason, I'm so in love
already
with Dominica. Yeah, I always say I'm from Portsmouth. Anyway, so we are actually conducting a study, but qualitative is a small study where we're trying to identify the relationship between climate and then, of course, mobility in the agriculture sector, looking at agriculture sector, farming, and of course fisheries, the fisheries sector, subsector, and all of that. So these are some of the this, like Raj indicated, that micro studies can actually contribute to identifying and mapping areas. And one of the issues that is coming up as I'm looking at, I was actually just doing the analysis now before I came in for it, has to do with, you know, people being forced or having to move to risky areas or unaware and to engage in the agriculture activities and all of that. And even for those who were affected by Hurricane Maria in 2017, and they had to lose everything and they had no choice or nowhere to go, but then to come back to those same risky areas. So, and you had some of the research participants actually even complain that the government is doing nothing. It's the responsibility of the government to take up that initiative to demarcate areas that, look, these are high risk areas, and also to find ways, you know, to relocate. But when you are looking at all of these issues, you look at capacity in terms of the available expertise to be able to actually undertake the, I mean, we all know from existing state forms that, for example, the Kalinago, that's the indigenous people, for example, they are one of the most marginalized and vulnerable in the country. But then, of course, you have to come up with initiatives that can actually empower these people, not necessarily moving them, but empower, because if you're looking at vulnerability goes beyond just moving them from the local, the high risk areas, but then how you can empower these people to to actually be able to take control of their lives and also promote resilience. So it goes beyond just moving, but actually having the expertise, the institutional setup to be able to do that, the political will, and of course the resources. And that is one of the main problems that is often comes to issues of zoning or mapping of vulnerability mapping. These things are already there, people are aware, but then as to how government can really dedicate that. So there are often competing interests. So for example, the interest is that, oh, maybe you want to, budgetary allocation, maybe you want to give this amount of money to the health sector, agriculture sector, and all of that. So if these are competing areas because maybe people are dying from degenerative diseases, there's heart problems, diabetes, and all of that. So you might want to find ways to establish a system to be able to address, these non-communicable diseases, as opposed to, looking at the possible impact of hurricanes, which according to the research that they've done, happens in every 4 years and all of that. Of course, when there's an impact, it reverses the country years back as they have to, recover and pick up and rebound and do all of that. So it, erodes years of progress that have already been made. But then, like Raj indicated, the issue always have to do with the commitment on the one hand to look at what are the competing interests at the national level, the existing national basket. Is there a designated budget or basket that, okay, in terms of impact or even climate change adaptation, that this budget sitting there is purely really for adaptation or promoting climate resilience in terms of what, relocating these people, improving on their livelihoods and all of that as ways to improve their resilience. And of course, do you have the necessary expertise and technology? Maybe you want to have drones that can constantly, monitor, take aerial photos to be able to come back and analyze in how far the coastline is changing, coastal erosion, land degradation, or even forest cover or land use cover change. What are the available information in terms of data? In the case of Dominica and in many other, data has been a problem. We did a study on data, climate change and mobility data, and realized that even for the Central Statistics Office, the information they have even on migration, or even if you look at the census questionnaire, it does not make provision, to address people who might actually, ask questions about persons who moved or did not move as a result of climate change. So these are some of the challenges that, not that the knowledge or awareness is not there, it is there, but these issues relating to expertise, availability of data, technology, resources, and all of that, and of course, the political commitment. So these are some of the issues that we really need to go beyond the vulnerability mapping to address. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Raj. Thank you, Dr. Adaawen. This was a very interesting discussion. Do we have more responses, questions? Professor Khadia, I'd also like to hear your thoughts on the discussion that's happening.
Well, I was listening. Thank you, Dr. Adaawen. I think it was very enlightening to listen to this subject, which is very new in the field of migration. I have a different kind of a question that was crossing my mind. I don't know whether this is the right forum to ask that question. We have addressed the issue of migration as a result of climate change. But what about the other way around? Climate change because of migration, and whether we do have solutions to climate change using migration as a driver of that. Whether there are congested cities and other places, whether they could be decongested through migration, through encouragement of migration, positive kind of policies, using migration as a tool for addressing issues of climate change. This is just completely opposite of what we have been talking about. So if you have any thoughts on that question.
Yeah, that's a really very interesting question. Why am I saying so? Because I was recently involved in a study that we did in Lesotho. Lesotho is in southern Africa, just in the middle of South Africa. So we're looking at climate mobility and then return and sustainable reintegration. You know, we have many of Basotho. I mean, people from Lesotho, they call them Basotho, you know, moving to South Africa to work. And in the face of the COVID-19 impact and all of that, people were returning. And considering that the country itself is a landlocked country, it was also being, you know, and even in the Southern Africa region, you've seen reports of recurring severe droughts and floods and all of that. So with a country that has more than half of its population, or the majority of the population engaged in the agricultural sector, and poverty levels are really very high, remittances from Southern Africa plays a very key role. So with these people returning, we're now trying to see, for example, what are the avenues or possibilities for sustainable reintegration, such that the drivers that even influence these people to move in the first place, people are able to overcome those drivers. And even if they move at all, then it is not as a result of those drivers, but out of their own will that they wish to move. So as one of those initiatives, we wanted to look for these people coming. How can they and in turn affect climate change or even contribute to environmental degradation? And one of the issues that came up was that, number one, these people, when they come back, you know, they do not have any clue about ongoing community initiatives to enhance environmental conservation and all of that. And when they come, they have no expertise, for example, in sustainable farming practices and all of those. So when they come, they just do whatever they want because of probably they've come back with some economic empowerment in terms of money that they come back with and all of that. But even coming back to the question of reverse migration and how that can contribute. And we know that cities are areas of congestion, you know, urbanization, you have people moving in and all of that. And they are often referred to as what? Heat islands. So if you take that into consideration, it has to do with building congestion, vehicular traffic, and high levels of carbon emission and all of that. So as part of decongestion and climate change initiatives, it can actually even be, you know, good in the sense that people can begin to urban expansion, so that instead of congesting people in one place and rather even contributing or exposing people to climate change impacts, and you find that most people tend to cluster around slums that are often near to the coastal areas in most of the cities, coastal cities, you have them. So in that case, you can actually begin to think about, for example, urban expansion, looking at green spaces, and also encouraging people to move outskirts of town. And how can you do that? It's not necessarily going to build nice, fancy buildings out of town, where you are even contributing to taking over peri-urban lands that would have been used for farming activities and all of that, but also looking at transport and how far are these areas that you are asking people to go out as part of climate change initiatives accessible to the city center. And you find that in most parts of our world, you will have government businesses, ministries, and whatnot clustered and concentrated in the central business district of all the big shops and all of that. If you look at, we have had the opportunity to live in Europe, you have all these buildings and ministries scattered and dotted around. Every community or area has a shopping center that you can actually just walk 10 minutes or 5 minutes to access. How are these social amenities, hospitals, clinics available within these areas? That will bring us to what? Urban planning. How are we able to allow people to do effective urban planning?
Yeah, in fact, I did suggest that immediately after the lockdown in India, which created a massive movement within India, from the cities to the rural places, to the houses and so on. And that's when I had written a blog in this well-known magazine called Down to Earth. It's actually, Down to Earth is a very popular science magazine addressing issues of climate change and other issues. So I think that's something which probably can be taken forward in our discussion. This is something, and I must congratulate you. I was just reading your that joint article with so many authors on in International Migration Special Issue edited by
the new research
Susan
agenda.
Martin, my friend. Yes, so I had not finished reading it, but I could see that this is a very good kind of a summary and reviewed article, which could help many young scholars to to get a feel of the field.
Thank you.
So once again, thank you very much. Certainly, we can carry on this dialogue forever.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Khadia. Thank you for the insights, and thank you, Dr. Adaawen. Do we have more questions? Yeah, yes, Professor.
Yes. I think it's the last question. Professor Khadia's question is interesting, and the answer was equally illuminating. The factors that pull people to urban areas or to more prosperous areas, if those conditions are created in the areas which are currently not congested or depopulated and so on, this is like creating alternative cities. In other words, not the regular cities. These are alternative cities. That is the kind of environment that cities provide, or the facilities and the amenities. And I think Bangladesh is creating that in the process of setting up these alternative cities. At least it's in the thinking space. So I don't know how much we know about it. I have only heard, but I don't know what those will be.
Raj, I would like to submit here, Raj. I think this is a very important point you are adding. But I would like to think that it is not a new initiative. You see, many of the developed countries in the global north have it for ages, that they have this provincial system in Canada, where provincial governments and others, they encourage people to take up jobs, and they encourage international, professionals and so on, that they will expedite their visas and settle them if they choose to live in remote areas and not in the popular areas. So it is there. What we need to do is to look into our kitty, that that whether we do have examples already and build upon them. I think that's where your examples of Bangladesh would probably fit in. And I think in the global south, this is something which needs to be adopted in global south.
Exactly. I have in mind the global south, because the global north, we know how they attract people. They provide amenities first, and then they put out this call.
Right.
And there are different ways to incentivize, and then people go, and those becomes alternative cities. But resources might be one thing, but also the ability, the far sight. In other words,
far sight, yes.
If you only think that cities are, the conventional cities, and that you can't create more cities where people will go, because you create opportunities and you give them the possibilities. So I think this is like thinking ahead, and perhaps sharing those experiences from the north to the south. And what are the major constraints? Is it just the money, or is the lack of ideas, or is the innovative spirit? Is there the innovative spirit, or even for that matter, confidence that people will move, that we put the money there and people, no, I think I like that city. I don't want to go to new city. So I think there are a lot of factors, and perhaps some kind of dialogue between the north and countries in the south that they're willing to experiment could be created. But thank you so much. Dr. Adaawen, great. And Manjima, great moderating. Excellent. Thank you very much. And sorry to keep coming, and I can't. This is my pet research area. Thank you again. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Raj.
Iman probably is raising her hand. Yeah.
Thank you. Good morning and afternoon to you. And sorry, I was listening on YouTube actually live, and the discussion is quite interesting. I'd like just to make a comment with regards to the mapping exercise proposed by Dr. Raj and Dr. Adaawen. My background is medicine and public health and migration and refugee studies. Having just recently returned earlier this year from Turkey, that was one form of a disaster that was massive, displaced thousands of people. And I'm trying to think globally of the possibility of mapping exercises, and I don't see it happening unless we apply some form of systems thinking, and we will still have many gaps. For example, we still don't have a global system that would predict earthquakes well ahead of time up until now. And now just shifting and looking at Libya, where yes, this is a climate issue, but what it has led to is the collapse of dams due to governance issues and lack of maintenance of these facilities. And then the large numbers of deaths happened because of the people washed out into the sea by these dams. This is another complex form. So what are we going to map? How are we going to map it? What types of disasters are? And look at Canada now. We have the usual is forest fires in British Columbia. And this year they have been far more, expanding into other territories, up down to Ontario even. So I think the speed with which what is called quote unquote natural disasters, the speed with which these catastrophes and disasters are moving is well ahead of any form of mapping or activity for us to try and mitigate and understand and try to work around these or try to bring things together. So I would just like to hear your reflection. Thank you very much.
Yes, Dr. Adaawen. You're muted.
Oh, I thought she was directing to Raj.
I would be happy to know insights of both of you.
Yeah, Iman, sorry can you just in one sentence just indicate what exactly you want to hear my thoughts on? I've heard what you indicated about the mapping issue, but then if you could just one sentence, please.
Yeah, how practical and how efficient on a global scale do you think such mapping can be done? And what are we mapping specifically when we have a complexity of factors? Yeah. What do you think of systems, applying systems thinking and how? Thank you.
Yes, if you look at, for example, in the context of the UNCCD, or even in the context of land management, we've had instances where people have actually come in with tools, to be able to map land degradation or degraded areas. But then I also do share in the fact that in the context of climate mobility, we've actually emphasized the fact that it is multi-causal in terms of many factors that come in. But then in terms of Raj's submission, I was looking at it in terms of actually mapping these vulnerability mapping in terms of all these areas that are actually vulnerable, to look at in going beyond the mapping of the physical areas in terms of how vulnerable they are to climate change impacts, to also look at the socioeconomic vulnerabilities and how far these climate factors can actually exacerbate these vulnerabilities and thereby contributing to movement. But then even if in terms of this socioeconomic, the migration decision is actually also dependent on the vulnerable person. So I do agree with you that it's going to be really complex in terms of how you are able to map that. But then mapping the vulnerabilities in terms of the physical space and the existing vulnerabilities, socioeconomic vulnerabilities of these people can already give you an idea as to the measures you can put in place to promote or enhance their resilience in terms of the possibility that they might actually, predisposed to move in the face of climate change impact. So that is how I see. But if Prof. Kadra or Raj also has a different perspective to it, then that is very well. But I honestly do agree with you that it will really be very complex to have a complete system that will be able to determine or map the what actually influences movement and how to address that. You know, so these are the issues that I can also talk to in terms of your questions.
Professor Khadra, Dr. Raj, do you like to respond to this? Mapping vulnerabilities?
Yes. What I was trying to say okay, I mean, it's very difficult to predict because the way climate is changing is rapid, is unpredictable. But that doesn't mean that we should be moving people to areas which are already, which are likely to. So it's a question of likely to get affected by, there are certain areas which are prone to getting these disasters. So you're not going to move your population there. You're going to get the people out and you're going to see where they could go. And same with when people are moving internally, as Dr. Adaawen mentioned, that we have to make sure that people are not crowded in those areas because they will generate more emissions and they will generate more problems. So when you're mapping is that certain areas are not ready, and that's part of the urban, or that's part of the country and urban planning, that these are the areas which are not habitable. So certain areas will become inhabitable, right? So even though people may have some belongings, they may have some attachment to the areas, they have to be convinced that they are uninhabitable areas because there are more risks. Their life is in danger, their livelihood is in danger. So that is what I think both Stephen and myself had in mind, and not that when a dam breaks, you know, everybody gets washed away. But, you know, we don't know with these calamities how and what sort of shape they're going to take and how that would affect the pattern of migration. It's preparedness. That's the most we can do. We don't know the future. But what we can do is to prepare to see how we can protect people and their livelihood and their cultures and their all kinds of things, because it's in a flux. Everything is in a very bad state these days. You know, you cannot plan. Places where you didn't expect earthquake would happen. We didn't expect in Dominica to have the hurricane to that extent, but it just devastated. Thankfully, you know, people had relatives next door in their islands, because we don't have next door, we don't have lands where you say you move to another place. You have to leave, you have to go to another island or go somewhere else. So I think the watchword is preparedness and vigilance, and be on your toes. And the rest is, you know, we can't guard the future, but we can prepare as much as our expertise and resources allow us. Thanks very much, but that's an interesting question. Okay, I think I'll stop here. I've spoken enough.
Thank you, Dr. Raj. Mr. Khadra, would you like to add something? Okay, you're good to go. Okay, thank you, Dr. Iman, for the question. It was really interesting and quite thought-provoking, the discussion we had. So do we have any follow-up questions or responses?
Well, I just wish to thank Prof. Raj and Dr. Adaawen. I come from Sudan, a country with multiple development-induced displacement. So I think there might be some learning to do from the domain of development-induced displacement. We have a major population displaced by the Aswan High Dam, which was built at the south of Egypt. And up until now, we have some heritage submerged in the reservoir lake. We have a lot of like archaeological finds and history. Looking also at a topic I studied for my master's, and that was a dam project where we did have the land, people were moved. The government thought this is a successful move, but the problem was that the land, the quality of soil and land. These are agrarian communities living around the Nile. When they were moved to a more desert land, difficult to cultivate, they faced real hardships. So I think the nature of livelihoods, and I think Dr. Stephen noted that, not rendering people vulnerable because we are moving them, but they cannot sustain their form of livelihoods. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Iman, for sharing that. It's always a trickier question when the choice is between certain developmental projects and then the movement associated with those developmental projects. So since we have also overshot the time limit, I would be concluding the discussion. I hope there are no follow-up questions or responses. Okay, so thank you, Dr. Adaawen, for this very enriching discussion. And I also thank the participants for actively intervening and discussing various nuances associated with climate change and human mobility. I can see that we are also joined by students from IGNOU, and I hope the students as well as all participants have key takeaways from the discussion that they carry forward in their research journey. So thank you, Dr. Raman. Thank you for all the participants. And I'd also like to inform that there would be a subsequent discussion that is happening on climate change and human mobility, addressing the factor of internal migration, how internal migration plays into this narrative of climate-induced migration. And it will be moderated by Professor Raj. So looking forward to seeing you all during the next discussion. I shall be releasing the details soon. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Raman. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Great
Thank
job. Enjoy
Thank
the
you.
session. Thank you very much.
Thank
I'll
you.
be in touch. Stephen, I'll be dropping you a note
Yes, please.
about
Okay, thank you.
the work.
Yeah.
I'm envious of the work you're doing in Dominica.
Yes, yes. I'm getting
I need to know more about it.
WhatsApp messages
All right.
from the World Bank team asking for information. I'm
Okay,
supposed
all
to
right.
submit the report yesterday, but I'm not able to do it. So